Keanu Reeves sat on an old wooden bench in a bustling city park, blending seamlessly into the afternoon scene. The golden sunlight filtered through the trees, casting long shadows as children laughed near the fountain, and the soft notes of a street musician's saxophone drifted through the air. Dressed in a faded brown jacket with frayed cuffs, well-worn jeans, and scuffed boots that looked like they had traveled countless miles, he seemed like just another passerby taking a break from the day. A worn-out baseball cap was pulled low over his face, obscuring his unmistakable features from those who might recognize him. With the sketchpad resting on his lap, Keanu's hand moved methodically across the page, capturing the rippling reflection of the fountain in pencil strokes. His presence was unassuming, just a quiet man absorbed in his art, lost in the simplicity of the moment. Unlike many in Hollywood who bask in the glow of their fame, Keanu had always found solace in everyday moments, choosing anonymity over attention. He wasn't there for recognition or spectacle, he was simply enjoying a peaceful afternoon, unaware that his presence would soon become the catalyst for a movement far greater than himself. Officer Daniels and Officer Harris had been patrolling the park for most of the afternoon, keeping an eye out for anything that seemed out of place. Daniels, a young officer eager to prove himself, was sharp-eyed and rigid in his approach to law enforcement. He believed in maintaining order at all costs, often interpreting harmless situations as potential threats. Harris, on the other hand, was a veteran on the force, slower to react and more measured in his judgment. He had seen too many situations escalate unnecessarily and preferred to de-escalate when possible. As they walked along the gravel path near the fountain, Daniel's eyes landed on Keanu Reeves sitting alone on a weathered wooden bench, his head slightly bent over his sketch pad. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed, and the satchel beside him looked aged. To Daniels, he appeared like just another vagrant, someone who might be making the park an unofficial home. He nudged Harris and gestured toward Keanu. "Over there," Daniel said, his voice firm. "Another drifter making this place look like a campsite." Harris sighed, shifting the weight of his utility belt. "He's just sitting there," he said, unwilling to jump to conclusions. Daniels, however, was already moving toward Keanu, his boots crunching against the path with determination. His stance was authoritative, his presence unmistakably that of someone in control. He stopped a few feet from the bench and cleared his throat loudly, demanding attention. "Excuse me, sir," Daniel said, his voice edged with authority. "This is a public park. You can't just loiter here all day." Keanu paused for a brief moment before looking up, his face calm, his expression unreadable. He wasn't startled, nor was he defensive. Instead, he responded with an air of quiet patience. "I'm not bothering anyone," Keanu replied evenly. "Just enjoying the day." Daniels folded his arms across his chest. "Enjoying the day, huh?" His tone was skeptical. He nodded toward the satchel beside Keanu. "What's in the bag?" Keanu glanced at the worn leather satchel and then back at the officer. "Just some pencils and a snack," he said plainly. "Nothing illegal, if that's what you're asking." Harris stepped closer but remained silent, studying Keanu's demeanor. There was no aggression in his posture, no signs of a threat, just a man sitting quietly, sketching. Daniels, however, wasn't satisfied. "Mind if we take a look?" he asked, though his tone made it clear it wasn't really a request. Keanu exhaled slowly and leaned back slightly. "Do I need to remind you that this is a public space?" he asked, his voice level. "I have every right to sit here." The tension between them thickened. A few feet away, a young woman walking her golden retriever slowed her pace, adjusting the leash while watching the exchange. Other passersby also took notice, their curiosity piqued. What had started as an ordinary afternoon was beginning to feel like something else entirely. As the tension between Keanu and Officer Daniels thickened, the atmosphere in the park subtly shifted. What had started as a routine afternoon was now becoming something else, something that drew attention. The sun still cast a golden glow over the area, but the easygoing laughter of children near the fountain seemed to fade, replaced by an uneasy silence. A young woman, Emily, who had been walking her golden retriever, slowed her pace, pretending to adjust the leash while keeping her eyes on the unfolding scene. Nearby, an elderly man, on a bench, lowered his newspaper, his gaze fixed on the confrontation. A jogger, slowing his stride, pulled out his phone, capturing the interaction from a distance. Keanu remained seated, calm, his sketchpad resting on his lap. His expression didn't shift, not with defiance, not with fear, just quiet patience. Officer Daniels, however, was growing increasingly agitated. His body language betrayed his frustration. His shoulders were stiff, his stance rigid, his hand twitching near his belt, as if ready to escalate at the first sign of defiance. "I'm going to ask you again," Daniels said, his voice firm. "You need to move along. This isn't your personal lounge." Keanu exhaled slowly, as if weighing his words carefully. "Is sitting on a bench a crime now?" he asked, his tone steady. Harris, who had remained on the sidelines, finally spoke up. His voice was softer, more measured. "Look, we're just trying to keep the park safe and welcoming for everyone," he said. "We don't want any trouble." Keanu's gaze shifted to Harris, his expression still neutral. "Neither do I." The response should have ended it. He wasn't breaking any laws, he wasn't disturbing anyone, yet Daniels didn't back down. There was something about Keanu's calmness, his refusal to cower, that seemed to make the younger officer feel as if he were losing control of the situation. His authority wasn't being met with the kind of submission he was used to, and that only fueled his frustration. Emily, still standing nearby, finally broke her silence. "He's not doing anything wrong," she called out, her voice firm but non-aggressive. Daniels turned sharply, his face hardening. "Ma'am, this doesn't concern you." But Emily didn't back down. "It does," she insisted, taking a step closer. "This is a public park. He has as much right to be here as anyone else." The crowd around them was growing. A few people had pulled out their phones recording the exchange. Murmurs spread through the park, and soon a few more voices chimed in. "This isn't right," someone muttered. "Yeah, leave the guy alone," another added. Keanu took in the growing audience, sensing the shift in the air. He reached into his satchel, his movements slow and deliberate. For a moment, Daniel's hand twitched near his holster, but Keanu simply pulled out a sandwich, unwrapping it as if the officers weren't even there. He took a bite, chewing thoughtfully, his eyes never leaving Daniel's. The sheer nonchalance of the action seemed to unnerve the officer even more. "You think this is funny?" Daniel snapped, stepping closer. Keanu swallowed his bite and met Daniel's gaze. "No," he said plainly. "I think it's sad that you feel the need to harass someone for sitting in a park." Daniel's face flushed red. His authority was being questioned in front of a crowd, and his patience was wearing thin. His jaw clenched, his fingers twitching as he struggled to maintain control. Harris shifted uncomfortably, sensing that things were spiraling in the wrong direction. "Dang, Daniels," Harris murmured under his breath. "Maybe we should—" No. Daniels cut him off sharply. His voice was tight, barely concealing his frustration. "This guy thinks he's smarter than us. I'm not letting it go." That was when Emily, her phone still in hand, lifted it higher and pressed record. Others followed her lead. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Keanu set his sandwich down on the bench beside him and brushed the crumbs from his lap. His voice was still calm, still steady. "You seem awfully determined, officer," he said, "almost as if you have something to prove." Daniel's face darkened. "Watch your tone," he warned, his voice low. Keanu tilted his head slightly. "Do you ever wonder how far you're willing to go just to feel in control?" The question landed heavily, hanging in the air between them. Daniel's jaw tightened, his muscles coiling with tension. From the crowd, another voice rang out. "What's he even doing wrong?" It was a man in jogging gear standing near the fountain. Daniels shot him a glare. "This is a police matter," he snapped. "Stay out of it." But the crowd wasn't buying it. Another person spoke up. "We're all watching," they said, "and it doesn't look like he's done anything wrong." Daniel's face burned. He could feel the weight of the stares, the judgment, the silent condemnation. His hand hovered near his belt, an instinctual reaction, but Harris, reading the moment, stepped between them. "Ooh, back off," Harris said firmly, his hand pressing lightly against Daniel's chest. His voice had dropped to a warning tone. "You're making it worse." Daniel's fist clenched at his sides, but for the first time he hesitated. The weight of the moment was pressing down on him. The eyes of the public, the cameras, the sheer force of attention. It was suffocating. And Keanu, still seated, still calm, simply held his gaze. "Sometimes actions speak louder than words," he said. Then, turning slightly toward the crowd, he added, "If you think this is worth watching, hit one in the comments. Let's see who's paying attention." The silence fell for a brief moment, then the quiet sound of fingers tapping on screens filled the air. The live stream had already begun spreading, and Daniels could feel the ground shifting beneath him. What had started as an ordinary encounter had now become something much bigger. The tension in the park was thick, as if the air itself had taken on weight. Officer Daniels' frustration was clear. His authority was being questioned, and it was happening in front of a growing crowd, all with their phones raised, capturing every second of the encounter. Keanu Reeves, however, remained unfazed, his demeanor as calm as ever. His quiet resistance wasn't loud, wasn't aggressive, yet it was enough to shake Daniels to his core. Keanu reached into his satchel again. Daniels' hand twitched toward his holster, a reflex, a conditioned response to the unknown. But what Keanu pulled out wasn't a weapon. It was a small, battered device that, at first glance, looked like an old portable radio. He flipped a switch, and a tiny red light blinked to life. The crowd murmured in confusion. Daniels narrowed his eyes. "What the hell is that?" he demanded, his voice sharp. Keanu didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned the device toward the crowd, letting the blinking red light speak for itself before responding in a measured tone. "This," Keanu said, his voice carrying through the silence, "is a live-streaming camera." A ripple of surprise spread through the onlookers. Emily, still holding her phone up, audibly gasped before breaking into a small, approving smirk. She knew what this meant. Keanu wasn't just recording. He was broadcasting everything in real time. Daniel's face turned a deep shade of red. His anger shifted into something closer to panic. "You've been recording us?" he snapped. Keanu nodded, his expression unreadable. "The whole time," he said simply, "and so has everyone else." The reality of the situation crashed over Daniels like a tidal wave. He looked around at the sea of faces, the raised phones, the silent judgment hanging in the air. It wasn't just a few people watching anymore. It was potentially thousands, maybe even millions, if this live stream had already spread. "You can't just record us without permission," Daniels barked, desperation creeping into his voice. Keanu tilted his head slightly, the barest hint of a smirk appearing on his lips. "This is a public space," he reminded him. "Just like you told me a minute ago. You're public servants, aren't you?" A few people in the crowd chuckled. Others murmured their approval. Harris, standing just behind Daniels, ran a hand down his face, looking more and more uncomfortable with every passing second. "Daniels," Harris muttered, his voice low, "we need to leave. Now." But Daniels wasn't ready to back down. His entire career had been built on control, on being the one with the upper hand. And right now, he had lost it. His authority, his ability to command the situation, was slipping through his fingers like sand. "You think this little stunt is going to scare me?" Daniels challenged, his voice trembling with barely contained rage. Keanu, still seated, still composed, met Daniels' glare with unwavering steadiness. "It's not about scaring you," he said. "It's about holding people accountable." As if on cue, the sound of approaching sirens cut through the air. A black SUV pulled into the park, its lights flashing but its sirens silent. The crowd instinctively parted as the vehicle rolled to a stop near the fountain. The doors opened and a woman stepped out. Captain Morgan, the commanding officer of Daniels and Harris. She was tall, confident, and carried herself with an air of quiet authority. Her sharp eyes scanned the scene, taking in the crowd, the raised phones, and, most importantly, the blinking red light on Keanu's live streaming device. She exhaled slowly, already knowing that whatever was happening here had gotten out of control. "Officers," she said, her voice even but firm, "what's going on here?" Harris was the first to step forward. "Captain, it's just a misunderstanding," he began, hands raised in a placating gesture. "We were just—" Morgan held up a hand, silencing him. Then she turned to Keanu. Her expression was unreadable, but her eyes held the weight of someone who had dealt with too many incidents like this before. "And you are?" she asked. Keanu stood slowly, adjusting his cap as he met her gaze. "Just a guy sitting on a bench," he said simply. Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. Her gaze flicked to Daniels, whose face was still burning with barely concealed rage, then back to Keanu. She exhaled through her nose and crossed her arms. "Is there a reason this interaction needed to escalate?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Keanu shrugged lightly. "I was wondering the same thing." Morgan took a long, assessing look at the scene. The live streaming device, the cameras, the crowd. She knew this wasn't just a moment. It was a moment that would ripple far beyond this park. "Officers," she said finally, her voice carrying the weight of finality, "return to the cruiser and await further instructions. I'll handle this from here." Harris didn't hesitate. He turned and walked toward the squad car, his shoulders slumping with relief. Daniels, however, lingered. his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw so tight it looked like it might crack. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, glaring at Keanu. Keanu didn't flinch. He simply held the officer's gaze for a long moment before responding, his voice calm but firm. "No," he said quietly, "it's just beginning." Morgan watched the two officers walk away, her eyes lingering on Daniels, whose stiff posture betrayed his simmering frustration. Then she turned back to Keanu. She gestured toward the bench. "May I sit?" Keanu nodded, stepping aside slightly to give her room. She lowered herself onto the bench, folding her hands in her lap. "I recognize you," she admitted, her tone even, "but I'm guessing this isn't just about you wanting some peace and quiet in the park." Keanu glanced at the blinking red light on his device before turning his gaze back to her. "You'd be right," he said. "It's about what happens when no one's watching. Or, at least when people think no one's watching." Morgan's lips pressed into a thin line. She nodded toward the live streaming device. "And now the entire world is watching thanks to you." Keanu's voice remained calm. "Shouldn't they be?" Morgan studied him for a moment before exhaling slowly. "I'll admit," she said, "this doesn't look good." Keanu tilted his head slightly. "It's not about looking good, it's about accountability." Morgan nodded slowly. She had spent her career walking the fine line between supporting her officers and ensuring justice was served. She knew Daniels had crossed a line today, and she knew the world wasn't going to look away. "Officer Daniels will face a full review of his actions," she said finally. "And if there's evidence of misconduct, he will be held accountable." Keanu nodded, satisfied. That's all anyone's asking for. Fairness. Morgan stood, brushing off her uniform. "You've made your point, Mr. Reeves, but next time I'd appreciate it if you brought your concerns to the department directly instead of staging a public spectacle." Keanu chuckled softly. "Sometimes," he said, "a public spectacle is the only way to get anyone to listen." Morgan didn't argue. She simply gave him a curt nod and walked back toward the cruiser, knowing that this was only the beginning of something much larger. As Captain Morgan walked toward the squad car, her boots crunching against the gravel path, she could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The entire city would hear about this. It was already too late to contain it. Keanu Reeves' livestream had ensured that. And while she had seen many incidents over her career, this one was different. Because this time, the world was watching in real time. Officer Daniels was standing near the squad car, his fists clenched, his face still flushed red with frustration. His breathing was heavy, his chest rising and falling rapidly, and his anger had not subsided. It was clear he didn't see himself as the problem. He saw himself as the victim. "Captain, you're not seriously gonna let this guy get away with..." Daniel started, his voice sharp, but Morgan cut him off with a look that could slice through steel. "I said, step away," she repeated, her tone cold and commanding. Daniels hesitated, his jaw tightening, but then he took a single step back. His entire body was stiff, rigid with barely contained fury. The crowd was still gathered, their phones still recording, waiting to see how this moment would play out. Some were whispering amongst themselves. Others were standing in silence, their eyes fixed on the unfolding drama. The young woman, Emily, who had spoken up earlier, was still standing near the fountain, her golden retriever now sitting beside her as she kept her phone trained on Daniels and Morgan. Morgan took a slow breath, then looked Daniels straight in the eye. "Hand over your badge and weapon." The park went silent. Daniels' mouth opened slightly in shock as if he hadn't heard her correctly. His expression flickered from confusion to disbelief, then quickly to anger. He started, but his voice faltered. Morgan didn't repeat herself. She simply extended her hand. Daniel shook his head, his face burning with humiliation. "You can't be serious," he muttered under his breath. "Now, Officer Daniels," Morgan said, her voice steady, unyielding. The crowd barely moved, but the energy in the air shifted. The authority that Daniels had wielded so aggressively just moments ago had crumbled in an instant. He was no longer in control. With shaking hands, Daniels unclipped his badge from his uniform, hesitated for a moment, then unholstered his gun. Slowly, reluctantly, he placed them in Morgan's outstretched hand. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Some people exchanged glances, others whispered in shock. A few even began to clap quietly, as if recognizing the significance of what had just happened. Morgan turned to Officer Harris, who had been standing awkwardly near the cruiser, watching the scene unfold with an expression that teetered between relief and guilt. "You'll be included in this review as well, Officer Harris," Morgan said firmly. Consider this your warning. You had an opportunity to de-escalate and you failed." Harris swallowed hard, his face paling slightly. He nodded once, understanding that arguing wouldn't help him. "Understood, Captain." Morgan turned back to Daniels. "You're on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending a full investigation." Daniels let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. He glanced at Keanu, still standing near the bench, silent but watching. "This isn't fair," he muttered. Morgan's eyes hardened. "What's not fair," she replied, her voice like steel, "is using your authority to intimidate someone who did nothing wrong." Daniels clenched his fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white, but he knew there was nothing he could do. Not here, not now, not with the entire city watching. Without another word, he turned on his heel and stormed off toward the police cruiser. Harris followed, but with far less certainty in his steps. Morgan stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision she had just made. She knew Daniels would fight this. He would push back, claim it was an overreaction, insist that he had been just doing his job. But the truth was clear. He had abused his power, and the department couldn't afford to protect officers who did. She turned back to Keanu, who had picked up his sketchpad again. He had barely moved during the entire exchange, but his eyes, calm, unwavering, met hers. "You've highlighted a real problem," she admitted, folding her arms. "But solving it takes more than exposing it." Keanu gave her a faint smile. "I know," he said, "but sometimes exposing it is the only way to make people care." Morgan exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure if she liked Keanu Reeves or not, but she respected him, and in this moment, she understood why he had done what he did. She turned and walked back toward the squad car where Daniels and Harris were seated inside. The moment she climbed into the front passenger seat, she knew that this was going to be one of the most scrutinized cases of her career. Back in the park, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Some lingered by the bench where Keanu had been sitting, as if it now held some deeper significance. Others whispered amongst themselves, still reeling from what they had just witnessed. Emily, standing near the fountain, stopped recording and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She looked down at her golden retriever, who wagged his tail as if sensing that the worst was over. Keanu sat back down on the bench and picked up a sketch pad as if nothing had happened, but he knew, just as everyone else in that park knew, that something had changed. A few minutes later, a jogger passed by the bench, pausing briefly. He glanced at Keanu, then at the note tucked under a small rock beside him. He bent down, picked it up, and read it. "Justice isn't given, it's earned. Keep watching, keep asking questions." The jogger smiled softly. He pulled out his phone, took a picture of the note, then placed it back exactly where he had found it. The sun was beginning to set over the park, painting the sky in warm hues of orange and pink. The day was ending, but the impact of what had happened here was just beginning. Keanu took one last look around, then quietly packed up his sketchpad and placed it in his satchel. With a final glance at the bench, he slung the bag over his shoulder and walked away. The park, once just another part of the city, had now become something more. A symbol, a reminder, and the world was still watching the aftermath of movement take shape. The events in the park didn't just end when Keanu Reeves walked away. What had started as a simple confrontation between an officer and a man sitting on a bench had now become something much larger. By the time the sun had set over the city, Keanu's live stream had already gone viral. Social media was flooded with clips of the encounter, shared across platforms like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. The hashtags "Justice on the Bench" and "Accountability Matters" began trending within hours. People from all over the country, some even from around the world, were watching and discussing what had happened. The video showed everything: Officer Daniels' aggression, Keanu's calm resistance, the crowd stepping in, and Captain Morgan finally holding her officers accountable. It wasn't just a single moment of police misconduct. It was a reflection of something bigger, something that had been happening in communities across America for years. But this time, there was proof, and this time, people weren't going to ignore it. The park bench becomes a symbol. By the next morning, reporters had already arrived at the park. News anchors stood near the fountain, speaking into cameras as they recounted the events of the previous day. Photos of the now famous bench spread online, and visitors began stopping by to take pictures. Some people left flowers, others left handwritten notes. One of them read, To the man who reminded us that standing up doesn't always mean standing. Sometimes it just means refusing to move. The park, once just another green space in the city, was now a focal point for a growing conversation about justice and accountability. People gathered in small groups, discussing not just what had happened, but what it meant. Local activists saw the opportunity to turn this moment into something more. Community organizers began planning events near the bench, public forums, discussions on police reform, and gatherings where people could share their own experiences. What had started as a quiet moment on a park bench had now sparked something much bigger. Keanu stays out of the spotlight. Despite being the catalyst for this movement, Keanu Reeves did what he always did. He stepped away from the attention. Reporters reached out to his representatives, hoping for a statement, an interview, anything. But Keanu had no interest in making this about himself. He wasn't looking for fame, wasn't trying to be a hero. He had simply done what he believed was right. While the media focused on the viral story, Keanu quietly continued his work behind the scenes. He donated anonymously to organizations that focused on police reform and community outreach. He connected with activists and legal experts to better understand the deeper issues at play. For Keanu, the real goal wasn't just to expose a problem, it was to be part of a solution. Officer Daniels faces consequences. Meanwhile, the fallout for Officer Daniels was swift. The department announced an internal investigation into his conduct, and within a week, he was officially placed on unpaid suspension. The review board determined that his behavior had been unprofessional and an abuse of authority. But for many in the community, that wasn't enough. Calls for greater accountability grew louder. People wanted more than just a temporary suspension. They wanted real change. Captain Morgan, now at the center of the controversy, found herself in a difficult position. She knew that Daniels wasn't the only officer in the department with a problem. His behavior was a symptom of a larger issue. If she truly wanted to regain public trust, she needed to push for real reforms. She took action. She implemented mandatory de-escalation training for all officers. She launched community outreach programs to rebuild relationships with local residents. And most importantly, she made it clear that officers who abused their power would not be protected. Change wasn't going to happen overnight. But this moment, this one small moment in a city park, had forced a conversation that could no longer be ignored. It was a lasting impact. A week after the incident, Keanu returned to the park late in the evening, just as the sun was setting. The once empty bench now had small mementos left by visitors. Flowers, notes, even a few sketches drawn by strangers. He walked up to the bench and sat down, taking a moment to take it all in. He reached into his satchel, pulled out a small notebook, and scribbled something on a piece of paper. He folded it carefully and placed it under the same rock where he had left his first note. The message read, "Justice isn't given, it's earned. Keep watching, keep asking questions." And with that, he stood up, adjusted his satchel, and quietly walked away. The movement had begun, and the world was still watching. From a moment to a movement. The days following the park incident marked the beginning of something bigger than anyone had anticipated. What had started as a single moment, a man sitting on a bench, an officer pushing too hard, had become a rallying point for discussions about justice, accountability, and the role of law enforcement in American communities. The Justice on the Bench movement gained traction beyond social media. News outlets continued to cover the story, bringing in legal analysts, community leaders, and even former law enforcement officers to weigh in. It wasn't just about Officer Daniels anymore. It was about the broader system that allowed officers like him to act without consequence for so long. Protests were organized not in anger, but in a push for reform. Community leaders held meetings with city officials demanding changes in policing policies. Universities hosted panels on civil rights and public accountability. The bench in the park, once just an ordinary seat, had now become a powerful symbol of resistance against abuse of authority. But beyond the public discussions, there were real, tangible changes beginning to take place. A shift in the police department. Captain Morgan knew she couldn't afford to let this moment pass without action. The city was watching, the media was watching, and most importantly, the community was watching. She implemented a new de-escalation training program for all officers, requiring them to undergo extensive education on handling tense situations without the use of excessive force. She worked closely with community leaders, organizing public forums where citizens could voice concerns and share their experiences with law enforcement. More than that, she began reviewing past complaints against officers like Daniels, cases that had been ignored or brushed aside. Some of those cases were reopened, leading to disciplinary actions against officers who had previously escaped accountability. For the first time in a long time, the community felt like they were being heard. Keanu Reeves remains behind the scenes. Despite being at the center of it all, Keanu Reeves continued to avoid the spotlight. News stations and talk shows repeatedly invited him to speak on what had happened, but he declined every interview. He didn't want to be the face of the movement. He wanted the conversation to remain focused on the issue, not on him. Instead, he quietly funded initiatives that supported community policing programs, legal aid for victims of police misconduct, and education on civil rights. He met with activists and policymakers, not for attention, but to listen and understand how he could contribute in a meaningful way. To him, this wasn't about heroism, it was about responsibility. The bench becomes a legacy. One afternoon, a group of volunteers installed a small plaque near the bench in the park. It read, "Dedicated to those who stand up for what's right, even when they're sitting down." People continued to visit, leaving flowers, notes, and small mementos. The bench had become a symbol not just of what happened that day, but of the power that ordinary people held when they chose to question authority, demand justice, and refuse to be silent. And the world was still watching. Despite the growing movement sparked by his actions, Keanu Reeves remained in the background, letting the momentum build without centering himself in the story. He had never intended to be a symbol. He had simply chosen to stand firm in a moment that mattered. While news outlets and social media continued to dissect the incident, Keanu quietly channeled his influence into meaningful action. He anonymously donated to legal defense funds for those who had been unfairly targeted by law enforcement. He supported community-led policing initiatives, helping bridge the gap between officers and the people they served. He met with activists, policymakers, and educators, not to take credit, but to listen and learn. When asked why he refused interviews, his response was always the same: "This isn't about me, it's about something bigger." Meanwhile, the bench in the park remained a powerful symbol of quiet resistance. People continued to visit, some leaving handwritten notes tucked under the same rock where Keanu had left his message. Others simply sat in silence, reflecting on what it meant to take a stand, even if it was just by staying seated. A local artist painted a mural near the park depicting the now famous scene: a man on a bench, a crowd watching, a moment of truth unfolding. Below it, in bold letters, were the words, "Justice begins when we choose not to look away." And even as the world moved forward, the lesson remained: one act of courage can spark a movement. A year after the incident, the park remained a quiet but powerful reminder of what had happened. The bench where Keanu Reeves once sat had become a landmark of sorts, visited by locals, activists, and even tourists who had followed the viral story. Some came to sit in silence, reflecting on the impact of a single act of defiance. Others left behind small notes, many of which carried messages of hope, justice, and resilience. One afternoon, a father and his young son stopped by the bench. The boy, no older than 10, held a small bouquet of daisies, carefully placing them on the seat. "Why are we leaving flowers here, Dad?" the boy asked. His father knelt beside him, reading one of the messages tucked under a rock. It was Keanu's original note. "Justice isn't given, it's earned. Keep watching, keep asking questions." The father smiled softly, because this is where someone reminded the world that doing the right thing doesn't always mean standing up. It can mean refusing to move. The boy thought for a moment, then nodded. "I'll remember that," he said. As the sun began to set over the park, the bench stood there, simple yet significant, a lasting testament to the power of one person choosing to stand firm. It was a reminder that justice begins with awareness, with accountability, and with the courage to speak, even in the quietest moments. The story of Keanu Reeves sitting on a bench and quietly standing up for justice teaches us a profound lesson. Change doesn't always come from grand gestures. It often begins with small, deliberate actions. In a world where injustice can feel overwhelming, it's easy to believe that one person can't make a difference. But this story reminds us that choosing to speak up, refusing to back down, and holding those in power accountable can create ripples that lead to real change. In today's society, we see similar moments unfold in everyday life. Whether it's a bystander filming an act of injustice, employees speaking out against unethical workplace practices, or students advocating for better education policies, the accessibility of social media has given individuals a platform to expose wrongdoing amplify unheard voices, and demand accountability. Applying this lesson to our daily lives means choosing to act even when it feels easier to look away. It means questioning unfair treatment, supporting movements that promote equality, and using our voices, whether online or in person, to stand for what's right. Because, as this story teaches us, justice isn't given, it's earned, and it starts with us.